Hello, welcome to this second test run of my Inky mystery files. Hopefully this one's going to be nice. It's called The Night Riders. Hi, I'm Inky, an investigative journalist working for what I think is a government organisation. They employed me some time ago, quite a long time ago now, to research, to report on any unusual instances in my hometown of Deal, just up the road from here. Deal is a very strange place, about 8 miles north of Dover, where I'm currently living. And it's back end of nowhere. Lots of strange things have happened there. Lots of smuggling going on, lots of stories of things happening. A lot of history has happened on this piece, a little bit of coast right by the channel, closest point to France. And it's also quite a popular place for people to hide if they want to escape, celebrities, villains, or whatever. So things go on here all the time when they never make the news, and when they do, they are not quite how things are reported. So for this one, I'm going to tell you a story about an instance some years ago now. During the course of one dark and dreary February, some years ago, a wild bit of gossip reached my desk. Now, Deal has always had a large number of pubs, slightly less of recent years, I have to say, which is a bit sad, but each with their own clientele and legends. But this particular bit of news was unusual. The gossip went out that towards the edge of town, down in Mungham and Ringwold, they're like on the very landward side edges of the town, there are reports from various pub goers spotted that looked like nighttime horse riders chasing down cars. That, for Deal, is very unusual, probably for anywhere else, to be honest. But even for Deal, that was unusual. Now, one or two reports could be classed as something like drunken chat or some kind of joke to impress out-of-towners. But this was across a number of the country pubs, consistently, and for more than a couple of occasions, quite sober people, not known for their wild flights of fancy. Now, of course, once this sort of gossip reached the populace of Deal, the locally questions were concerned that someone or a group of people were abusing animals. That kicked off a whole number of newspaper articles condoning irresponsible horse ownership. Over the course of 2 or 3 nights, things were escalating to such an extent, I decided to investigate. Unfortunately, I couldn't discern a pattern of instances, and because it was widespread across a number of localities, I couldn't be everywhere at once for the chance that something would happen. So I called in some help from a few friends who I tasked in hanging out at likely pubs to catch news as it happens. Now this could be a bit not surprising, really. Strangely enough, finding some volunteers to go with some free beer money to sit in a pub for the evening wasn't hard to find. So I left them with instructions to report anything unusual, and obviously more specifically, these horse riders. 2 nights, and not a dicky. I was worried that if this was a phase, it might now be over, or whoever is catching news of interest might have decided to call it a day before they got caught. Either way, I was a little disappointed at both lack of news and the amount of petty cash I had thrown to my researchers, so I was hoping for something. Then something happened which brought in the police, quite unexpectedly. A pub on the Deal to Dover Road That particular road is the busiest road in and out of town. Well, there's only 2 roads in and out of town, in and out of Deal, really, main roads anyway, and this was one of them. Yeah, I think it's the A256 or A2. No, it's the A259. The A256 is on the back end. So yes, it was quite late, close to closing time, and a report brought the road to being closed by the police. Now, in that particular pub, my volunteer Nick passed me the initial report of an accident involving a car and one of these riders. I feared the worst, and their hurried initial report left me waiting by the phone for more as and when they could report it. A couple of hours later, Nick was back on the phone with an amazingly wild tale. Apparently, according to the shaken driver of the car, who managed to mount the verge, reported a horse rider standing in the middle of the road as they approached Deal. They slowed down, fearing a collision. Then suddenly there was another trotting beside them. Must have been like in the middle of the road or in the other lane. But they couldn't really see much about it because all they got was the booted legs of the rider and the body of the horse as it trotted parallel with the car. Now they started to slow down before, fear of collision and so on. Now they couldn't quite hear. They thought they could hear shouting from the one beside them, but because it was, a late, cold night, they had the windows up and hot air blowing and the radio was on, so they couldn't make out the noise of what was being said. Next thing that happens completely shocked them. They see the rider ahead of them raise a hand, and then suddenly the pop and the windscreen just whites out, shatters. They panic, thinking the glass was going to hit them in the face, and because they couldn't see, they veered up off onto the verge. The driver reports that they were only in the car for moments when they managed to get out, but the riders, both of them, had gone. Now at that point, and this was between Ringwold and top of Deal, it's fields, and it was dark, really dark, and they couldn't make out any movement. Shaken and a bit concerned, they phoned the police, but luckily there was a patrol car on its way back from Dover, and they called up and provided assistance quickly. But they reported not seeing any other riders on their back along the road. So I got all this, and that really was very strange. Now, of course, with a serious incident and the possibility of firearms, the police were everywhere, and that included helicopters. But even after a few hours of fruitless searching, they found nothing. I called in my usual favours and made use of my official contacts and managed to obtain a copy of the driver's statement, which matched pretty much what Nick had told me. But there was something really not right about the description, primarily of the rider ahead of them. When they were describing what the rider looked like, it didn't quite fit with how I thought modern horse riders kitted themselves out. For example, those little tiny helmets they wear. This driver mentioned they saw a wide brim with a point, and that really didn't feel right for me. And then they described the sound of the gun. It was a pop, not a bang. I thought, oh, well, perhaps they've never really heard, sometimes backfiring cars cannot, feel that. So I asked for the police report on any kind of ballistics or, any firearms evidence. And yes, there was a lead bearing found inside on the well, on the back seat, it travelled quite a long way through. Not a bullet. It was evidently homemade, even though it was quite deformed. But it was a highly unusual projectile, maybe a BB gun, but no, this was lead. This wasn't aluminium or steel or anything like that. This was old. Now the picture was forming in my head. I feel was incredible. Perhaps maybe the same kind of idea is forming in your head now as highway robbers, but a couple hundred years too late. Now, with the official lines were that some dangerous idiots were out about and they needed catching. Now, I obviously did not decided not to throw in my crazy ideas into the pot to confuse the police. So I thought I better bring in my volunteers for a planning meeting on how we can help, but keep our distance. Now, we formed a few small little parties, each going out to one of the reported localities, some in the pub, some on the roads watching. Not a pleasant experience due to the time of year, but the whole mystery had caught our imaginations and we wanted to solve it. Now, I frequented the area of the unfortunate driver, taking turns with Nick on being in the pub or in the cold bushes by the roadside road. 3 nights we did this, each out in the cold. And I wondered if whoever was doing this had really decided to call it day after such a near fatal escalation. You know, it's quite high risk what they've been doing. Now, on my very last night, as I crouched cold and damp by the roadside, I saw something out in the field. The moon, while not completely full and the sky cloudy, did offer an occasional clear views across the fields to the windmill in the north and down towards Kingsdown and the coast. Now, some movement caught my eye on the field. Now, there was no noise, even though no real traffic at this time of night. It was around 10 p.m., something like that. Perhaps the field was sodden, but I could quite clearly see 2 horse riders galloping like a demon was chasing them across the fields towards me. I could make out dark clothes flapping behind them. And of course, these non-traditional riding hats, definitely very old, looking like 3-pointed hats I could see. Occasionally the moon would break and I could see pale skin of faces, not enough detail, unfortunately, at that distance. I could, however, make out some things flapping at the sides, hanging from belts, and it didn't take too long to recognize swords and firearms. Now, in the time it took me to take all this in, they'd covered half the distance to me, and they were coming straight at me. I was pretty certain they couldn't see me. I was in bushes, concealed, and my clothing was dark enough. Nevertheless, the terror was rising. I had no chance of making a run for it. They would definitely chase me down before I could even get halfway back to the pub to raise the alarm. And remember, they're armed, and they had no real compunction, nothing restraining them from using their weapons by the sounds of it. So I hope, beyond hope, that they hadn't seen me and I shrunk as small as I possibly could. Well, soon they were upon me. And then I heard of voices, which they were shouting at one another. I couldn't make it out, and it was very odd voice. And the hooves made a muted sound, and the horse snorting was weirdly echoey. Something really big, sort of, oh yeah, like even now, just recalling that. Hairs on the back of my neck rising and so on. But I could make out the faces of the riders. And it put fear in my stomach, twisting it as they bore down on me. And they leapt across the bushes, over me, across the road behind me. The riders' faces were pale, but they had their handkerchiefs or whatever. And I could see their skin was tight against their skull. It was horrifying, and eyes were just pools of darkness. Not a glint of normality in these faces, and I was glad the moon took quite a dip behind the cloud to save me from too long looking at this. This was not normal. That was not a human face I saw on both of them. Now, I was frozen with fear, and it took quite a while before I had the nerve to move. By then, I'd lost sight of them. I hurried to the pub where Nick was ensconced, nice and warm, and I had a very stiff drink just before last orders kicked in. Now, I managed to share a garbled explanation of my terrified and shaken state. We both then hurried out to scan the fields in case they would make another appearance. Unfortunately, no sign. Even after an hour longer waiting in the cold, we decided to call it a night. Well, on the way back into town, we decided to keep this experience to ourselves. Nick isn't one of those to make fanciful connections and quite down to earth, where some would say boring and dull. But at times like these, that is quite helpful because your mind could go off to very strange places here. Anyway, I reached home and welcomed my bed, but on the way, noticed the light on my answering machine flashing. I felt dread, which I couldn't explain, and a little curious, I pressed playback. It was a message from Robin in one of the other teams on the opposite side of the town, on the edge, interestingly in the direction where these horse riders were going. I knew what his breathless, hurried words were going to say. First, he said he had tried to get me on my mobile phone, but no answer. And I quickly checked my phone, and it was completely dead. So that was possibly helpful or not. That certainly would have alerted them had it rang at all, but that would have been after. As I was checking, he confirmed that what I expected him to say. The riders were involved in another incident, thankfully this time without any injury or any need to call, desperately to call the police and helicopters and all sorts. Although they managed to block the road, some poor guy on a moped got caught and intimidated by these two monstrously sized horses. They robbed him of some money and his watch. Robin then joked, saying the victim claims two guys were in fancy dress but couldn't quite identify them due to the handkerchiefs covering their lower faces. I was quite thankful that the aspect of these people weren't said anymore. So at that point, I just gave up and went to bed. Well, my dreams were vivid that night, full of highwaymen, smugglers, and revenue men. And I pondered on what to do as I ate my breakfast that next morning. First, I would head to the local library, I thought, and see what history we have on such criminals. Going by the history of Deal, I would imagine that would be fair. It's, although I wouldn't be surprised if it wasn't particularly useful. I remembered the head riders heading from Kingsdown, and that might reduce the search a bit, maybe. Kingsdown at the foot of the cliffs was a good place back in the day for landing contraband. Well away from the town, isolated, good cover of the cliffs, lots of places you could stash stuff quickly. Well, anyway, the morning was fruitless. A number of possible clues as to who these spectral creatures might have been. Or were they undead? I've got no idea. They looked pretty solid to me. But those faces were horrendous. Anyway, not dwelling on them much more, I headed to meet up with the team at a cafe on the seafront. Again, I kept my experiences the previous night to myself. And thankfully Nick did too. And we listened again to Robin's full report of the robbery. Then a thought occurred to me, you know the kind. Something that had been spinning around in my head surfaced, and it was from my dreams. Revenue men. Not knowing what these two riders were or how we would even be able to deal with them if we were confronting them, especially as they were armed, and they were quite they'd already caused damage to a vehicle with their weapons. They certainly could hurt us, but could we hurt them? I don't know. And obviously, I didn't want to put myself or the team into that kind of position. No. And this I had to admit, was a crazy idea. But what if we were to scare them? Now, with some reluctance, I voiced my crazy idea to the team, obviously skipping the fact that they might not actually be a living people. There was the expected stunned silence, followed by laughter. Except from Nick, of course, who knew where I was going. The others, remember, had no idea that we suspected and possibly still thought that we were dealing with two people play acting. That's what they thought. They thought they were normal living people. But I capitalized on that day saying, well, if they want to act out some kind of fantasy, might they respond to other people playing in a fancy dress as the opposition? There were some murmurs, and in the end, the team were game. So we set about putting the plans out for that night. I was busy the rest of the day, looking around at all sorts of fancy dress shops in town. And then calling on a few favours to actually get hold of some horses, because that would be vital. There's quite a few stables around town, and there's always some people wanting to exercise them. Time of night was a bit of a tricky one. So at the end of the day, half a dozen of us sat on horses on the dark edge of fields overlooking Kingsdown. I did honestly feel a bit foolish. My horse was nervous and no doubt wanted to be in a nice warm stable somewhere, and I certainly felt its pain. I was a little more comfortable on a horse than the rest, even though my experiences were limited. The rest of the team had quite possibly never ridden before. So those lending us the horses also dressed up and stayed nearby just in case the horses decided to go for a midnight gallop on their own. Now, coupled with the nervous horses who knew their riders had no idea, my fellow team dressed in whatever military fancy dress we could lay our hands on, quite possibly not even authentic for the last 200 years. We were getting colder and colder, waiting for things to happen. Glad it wasn't raining, because that really, I think everybody would have just gone home by then. The novelty of wearing the tight tunics and carrying swords and flintlocks did eventually start to wear off, with grumbles that the clothes were itchy and the hats were slipping, and they were all just had enough. I was hoping we wouldn't have to do this all night, and even more if we had to do it more than one night. As 11 p.m. approached and the moaning was getting to the point of mutiny, movement was spotted on the fields below. Great relief for the moment. We backed up the best we could to remain out of sight. Surprise was going to be key to make sure these things saw the shiny buttons, swords and hats, and not the fact that none of us matched and we weren't remotely going to be convincing up close. So, like last night, the faces I could see were covered by scarves. I was hoping the team wouldn't see the horrific face and freak out. That would certainly blow any chance of credibility. I distracted them by drawing my sword and raising it to shoulder height, ready to bring it down as a signal to advance. The pair of riders advancing rapidly. I had to get it just about right. The sky was beginning to go cloudy again, and I noticed a little bit of moonlight for the theatricals, but thankfully it wasn't going to be too much and reveal too much of our identity. I could make out more details, and the moon was beginning to poke out the clouds. At that moment, now I shouted and dropped my sword and tap my horse into movement. Trotting along, well, I hope we did. I did. I didn't see behind me, and I hope they didn't make a complete hash of it. A sudden emergence from the tree, however, caught their attention. They pulled up hard on their horses, which kicked up their forelegs into the air. To my horror, they drew their pistols. Now, I know we had some, but they were incapable of firing anything. And in my panic to make sure we maintained our advantage, I raised my sword, twirled it in the air, and let out a wild cry. I didn't expect that to have any impact. And I had no idea if that's what they would have done in the old days, but I had to make a noise and I had to encourage my cohorts. But it worked. Those two, let's say, for a better word, figures, it alarmed them. And they lowered their pistols and hesitated. Now we were moving faster. A quick glance either side, and I managed to catch at least one on each side of me, just behind me slightly, waving their swords and shouting. Now, our spectral foes were rattled, and I was deeply satisfied about that. Our ruse was working, and we pushed way beyond our luck, and possibly at a risk of blowing our credibility, to the ground by rushing at them. Now we traced them across the rest of the field. They turned and just lugged it. We never really gained on them, and then they disappeared into the tree line, into the woods. We pulled up some distance from there, breathless, but on a major high. Everybody was really, really quite wow. The adrenaline was flowing, and they were cheering. And although when they did dismount with some caution, they were pretty unsteady on their feet. But in any case, there was no sign of these robbers through the trees. That, I think, may have been the end of it. Days went by and no further reports of sightings. Thankfully, the team had not made out the features of these two riders, and so it remained with Nick and myself the possibility that we saw off some undead criminals, while everyone else thought our concerted effort was to end a gang of common criminals from a fake pretense of some very real robbery. That also was the solution on all the official channels. Well, we all know different now, don't we? Thank you, and I hope you enjoyed that. I did. That's quite a funky story. That might actually make it back to my Halloween special at the end of October. The Eventbrite stuff is up now. Go and book. It's all free. 3 nights, all free. And I got to write some ghost stories next then, haven't I? Thank you for watching. Leave comments, throw messages, whatever. Hope you enjoyed it. And until next time, bye-bye.